This story is about a man that has been behind bars since the 1980s. He was ultimately sentenced to 75 years and held responsible for what was done to another human being. He will begin serving that 75 years after he completes an 80-year sentence for conspiring to do harm to American citizens on behalf of the Libyan government. This is the story of Jeff Fort and some of the members of his gang. In the 1960s, Chicago was a city populated with project buildings that housed thousands of low-income citizens compacted into a small area. Because of the way society was structured, they had insufficient job and educational opportunities, and it created a situation of hopelessness, depression, violence, survival, and destruction. This is the environment that thousands of boys grew up in. Jeff was one of those boys. By the year 1965, 18-year-old Jeff and a man named Hairston was the leaders of a gang named the Blackstone Rangers. It was a group of boys around 9 to 18 years old, and at the time, the Rangers were snatching purses, breaking into stores and fighting gang wars with the Cobras, the Disciples, and other Southside gangs. Some members of the community associated with the church offered the church to be used as a youth center for the teenagers to meet up and play basketball, cards, ping pong, and other activities just to keep them off the streets. In 1967, powerful members of the community had an idea where they were able to secure a $900,000 grant that would be used to organize education and job training for the teens so they could better themselves and find purpose. The grant was paid to the Woodlawn organization, who would then disperse the funds to the program. Around this time, the Blackstone Rangers would change their name to the Black P-Stones. The P-Stones was a coalition of 21 other gangs from Chicago. The leader of each gang was a part of an internal group called the Main 21, and the Main 21 all fell under the leadership of Jeff Fort. This made Jeff an extremely powerful and dangerous man that would go on to control an army of 10,000 men. At the end of 1967, one of the leaders of the Stones, a man named Hairston, was arrested and charged for solicitation to commit murder. 7 months later, the country lost Martin Luther King Jr., and Chicago erupted. The next month, the violence between the P-Stones and the Disciples was escalating. So Jeff and the leader of the Disciples, David Barksdale, got together in an attempt to end the violence. At the end of the meeting, nothing was accomplished. Too much pride, too much money, too much power, and too many losses has taken place for a resolution of peace. The following evening, Chicago's gang intelligence unit stopped Barksdale and 2 other members of the Disciples. They asked Barksdale about the beef between the Disciples and the Rangers, and Barksdale told the detectives that the P-Stones put a hit on him. The detective asked him how does he know there's a hit out on him, and he replied, "All you have to do is follow me in an unmarked car and you'll see." The detectives followed him, and as he made a turn on Ellis Avenue, 8 teenagers appeared out of nowhere and unloaded into the car Barksdale was driving. The detectives jumped out and was able to arrest 3 of the teenagers. Barksdale was lucky. He made it out of the situation alive. The teenagers were then charged with attempted murder. Halfway through the year of 1968, the job training program had ended. And a few weeks later, testimony started before a United States Senate subcommittee.
Will you state your name, please?
Jeff Fort.
The investigation was focused around whether the government money was somehow used to support criminal organizations in Chicago. Since the year started, more than 30 people were due to gang-related violence. So the subcommittee was asking if any money from the $900,000 grant was somehow used to help the organizations do horrible things. And the P-Stones were in the middle of it all. The night before the testimony began, 2 members of the Disciples were hit in a doorway on 15th Street. During the investigation, the war between Chicago gangs on the South Side escalated. In the Dearborn projects, a boy named Raymond was hit. He didn't make it. 4 others were wounded with multiple injuries to the upper body, and the victims were all Disciples, and the perpetrators were all P-Stones. A high-ranking member of the P-Stones named George made a decision to testify to the subcommittee about weapons the P-Stones have in the stash. He also agreed to talk about how the gang leaders were receiving salaries and kickbacks from the job program administered by the Woodlawn organization. The chairman of the subcommittee argued that the money helped strengthen the P-Stones and the Disciples. There was testimony from a secret meeting between gangsters from Watts, Los Angeles, and members of the P-Stones from Chicago. The meeting was in a hotel, but this was around the time Detroit riots and racial tension was high. So the hotel security called law enforcement, and they were able to find the men having a meeting while in possession of multiple weapons. Jeff Fort was later subpoenaed, and so was Arthur Brazier, the head of the Woodlawn organization. One of the leaders of the Peace Stones, named Hairston, at 24 years old, was found guilty of hiring teenagers to kill 3 men. Back then, the Rangers were getting 12-year-olds to do the job for a sandwich and a $5 bill. When Jeff was called to testify before the Senate subcommittee, he refused. He stated his name, got up, and left. A month later, he was then indicted for contempt of Congress. By the end of 1968, gang violence got so bad that the Gang Intelligence Unit increased from 38 officers to 200 men. A few weeks later, Jeff and 60 other Peace Stones were arrested and charged with mob action and disorderly conduct. Jeff was invited to the first inauguration of President Nixon, and to the police officers of Chicago, this was a slap in the face. However, Jeff declined the invitation and sent Mickey Cogwell instead. The next month, a man that shot 2 disciples ran through a roadblock and was then charged with attempted murder of a policeman. Jeff was in fear of losing his life because of the infighting and issues with the Black Panthers and the East Side Disciples, so he started to move around with more security. At 22 years old, Jeff was sentenced to 6 months for another case. While he was doing time for that, he and 2 other men were charged with attempted murder and aggravated battery in connection with the shooting of a Vietnam veteran. The victim was hit 3 times. He survived. Halfway through the year, a high-ranking member of the Peace Stones named Paul had a press conference where he broke ties with the gang and made it clear that Jeff Fort had threatened to kill him. The Vietnam veteran name was Jackie, and Jackie worked for an organization called Concerned Vietnam Veterans, which was a crew attempting to keep neighborhood kids active and off the streets. He said on the night in question he was first hit in the leg, then he fell down. While he was on the ground, he turned around and saw Jeff, Andrew, and eBay. Then he saw flashes and he was hit 3 more times. Another witness said he saw Jeff, Andrew, and eBay unloading in the direction of Jackie. After Jeff and his crew left, the bystander helped Jackie get to a police car and they took him to the hospital. 90 days later, Paul, the guy who left the Peace Stones and said Jeff threatened to kill him, was hit 3 times. He didn't make it. 30 days after that, another member of the Black Peace Stones was found. His hands and feet were tied up with a bullet over his eyes. He was hit multiple times. He didn't make it. His name was Lawrence, a 23-year-old from Aberdeen Street. His wife, Claudette, told law enforcement that he was because he left the gang. This was right before the leaders of the Illinois Black Panthers, Fred Hampton and Mark Clark, was during a raid by the Chicago Tactical Unit. At his funeral, Jeff Fort and 300 members of the Black Peace Stone Nation, chairman of the Young Lords, Cha-Cha Jimenez, and Obed Lopez, representing the Latin American Defense Organization, showed up to pay their respects. President Nixon made it clear he wanted to extend his commission so it could be investigated how 2 leaders of the Black Panthers lost their lives. At the end of the year, a man named Harris was taken from his hotel room against his will. At the beginning of the year 1970, Jeff was held on charges, so his organization raised money for him to be released. The payment was made in $100 bills, and this displayed the fact that he was able to raise the money that quick, and it was seen as another sign of too much power. 2 weeks later, 100 African-American businessmen and gang leaders got together to discuss what needs to be done about all the extortion the gangs were doing to their own people in their own neighborhood. One of those people was Sammy Davis Jr. See, the Black Peace Stone Nation already got Sammy to invest $100,000 in their organization. At the time, Sammy just got done performing his new show, Golden Boy, on Broadway in New York. So when he took the show on the road to Chicago, Jeff Fort and the Nation wanted another $150,000. So Sammy Davis requested police protection. Early July, the trial for Jeff, eBay, and Andrew was to begin for the attempted Jackie, the Vietnam veteran. 7 days later, a 24-year-old friend of a witness became a victim on his way home while riding the bus. He didn't make it. They unloaded a sawed-off into the bus, their target, and injuring 5 other innocent bystanders. That same day, the actual 20-year-old witness from Ingleside Avenue was also hit. Other witnesses were put into a hotel, but then had to be moved after a visitor named Sam was caught with a weapon in the lobby of the hotel. He was a friend of one of the witnesses, but he was chased down by the Black Peace Stone Nation. The news outlets published this information and tried to link all the violence to Jeff and his gang. They did it in a way that sensationalized the violence and blame it all on Jeff. Partly because of this, that information was prejudicial, and therefore denied Jeff a fair trial, so the judge declared a mistrial and then issued a new date for a new trial. Early August, the Senate subcommittee asked Reverend Curtis to describe the intimidation tactics that he experienced from the gangs. So he told the subcommittee that Blacknation became interested in his organization when he received funding. He hired a few members of the gang, but they were not doing the job they were hired for, so he had to let them go. From that point, the gang began to him and his organization. He and his organization endured fire damage and other acts of intimidation after he fired those members of the gang. The Peace Stones unloaded into his home and his church, and the week before his testimony, the church was fired, which led to the closing of his office and the closing of the community organization. At this point, Jeff's ego was on another level. He was holding his own press conferences and displaying to the world his power and influence over thousands of other men that were willing to do anything he told them to do. That same month, members of the gang made a detective and military veteran named James Alfano a victim. He didn't make it. A warrant was issued for Jeff and his partner eBay for attempted. They also failed to appear for the new trial date for attempting to kill Jackie, since the last time ended in a mistrial. Jeff and Mickey and two other members of the gang were also facing charges for taking a man named Harris from his hotel room against his will. A Cook County grand jury also issued a warrant for eBay, and he was indicted for the murder of police detective James Alfano. The city was tense, crime was out of control, and all the gangs made everyday life horrible for the average citizen. The gang intelligence unit wanted Jeff, but couldn't find him, so they put surveillance on his girlfriend, and it paid off. Her name was Janice, from East Marquette Road. And on a Wednesday night, they followed her, and saw her buying a plane ticket for a United Airlines flight to New York. After she left the ticket booth and boarded the flight, the detectives boarded the flight also. 10 minutes after takeoff, the detectives gave a message to the flight attendant, and the flight attendant gave that message to the pilot. That message was to notify NYPD to meet Chicago detectives at JFK International Airport when the plane landed. Janice got off the plane and took a cab to a hotel located on the east side of Manhattan. They waited until 2 a.m., and the Chicago detectives and NYPD arrested everybody, including Jeff, his girlfriend, and another member of the gang that was wanted for questioning in a double. They found a bunch of money and passports with stamps, proving that Jeff was in Barbados on the dates he was supposed to show up in a Chicago courtroom. After further investigation of his immunization papers, sources of the NYPD alleged he was heading to Canada, and from Canada joined his friends in Algeria. 4 weeks later, Jeff's brother Willie was arrested and charged for possession and unlawful use of a weapon. 2 months after his arrest in New York, Jeff was extradited to Chicago to stand trial for multiple charges with bail set at $800,000. The Court of Appeals upheld the conviction for contempt of Congress and in turn convicted Jeff for refusing to answer questions in front of the Senate subcommittee. A few weeks later, 3 men robbed a pawn shop and took an employee against their will. After police showed up, they had a shootout. When reinforcements showed up and surrounded the robbers, they gave up and surrendered. The getaway driver got away, and the police identified him as Benny, who was Jeff's younger brother. 2 weeks after that, 15 Peace Stone members were indicted for fraud relating to the $900,000 grant. One of the cases against Jeff was dismissed as the prosecution was now unable to locate the witness. Benny Fort was sentenced to a 1 of 3 for jumping bail and an earlier conviction. Jeff's attorney motioned for a mistrial after Harris said a man threatened him. Harris said that a man walked up to him and told him, "You remembered what happened to Marsh, don't you?" That was referring to the case where Marsh testified as a state's witness against the Peace Stone members responsible for what happened to the policeman, James Alfano. After his testimony, Marsh was hit 5 times, and the Peace Stone members accused of the police officer got off scot-free. A week later, Jeff was found innocent of attempted murder. The story is, they allegedly beat Harris in an apartment in order to get him to give up the location of a man they were looking for. Harris testified under oath that they put a pillowcase over his head and he heard a click. He said that Mickey and Robert took him to an alley behind Union Avenue and he was able to wrestle the gun from Mickey. He then let off a few rounds and Mickey and Robert ran away. The jury could not come to an agreement, and after 120 times of votes and discussions, they still couldn't come to an agreement. Of the 12 jurors, the vote was still 11 to 1, as the only African-American juror couldn't agree to a guilty verdict. So Jeff, Mickey, and Robert were found of attempted murder. 4 weeks after this case, the appellate court upheld a conviction of 6 months in prison for Jeff for another case where he was held responsible for what he did to a post office employee. As for the attempted murder case with the Vietnam veteran Jackie, a mistrial was declared because 8 members of the jury feared for their life. Cook County decided to postpone the trial until a new system for jury selection and safety precautions were established. Attorneys that were defending 14 members of law enforcement, including the raid that resulted in the death of 2 Black Panther leaders, were asking the public for help in raising $250,000 to pay for the fees related to their defense. By this time, Jeff has been in jail for over a year with that $800,000 bail. 15 other members of the gang were indicted for crimes related to the $900,000 grant. Now it was time for the third jury to deliberate in the Jackie Turner Vietnam veteran case. They returned a verdict of not guilty, but at the last minute when the judge polled each juror individually, one juror changed his mind. So they went back and resumed deliberations. The jury then returned and it was once again a mistrial. This was the third mistrial for this case, as the jury was deadlocked 11-1. A new trial was ordered. 2 weeks later, the star witness changed his mind and stated that he was broken by the pressure of 3 mistrials and the intimidation against him and his family. He said he had to move every 3 days because he feared for his life, so he will not be testifying against Jeff or the gang. 4 months later, Jeff was found guilty for bail jumping and going to New York. The next month, the trial for Jeff and 15 members of the Black Peace Donation was getting started. This was a big deal. The court had to build metal walls and deploy metal detectors. The main issue was this. A few years ago, a grant for more than $900,000 was created with the intention to help kids in the community gain education and skills to get a job. As an incentive, they would get paid while going through the program. This would help give them some self-worth and meaning to their life, but the gangs would corrupt this whole process, and this is how they did it. Ex-members of the gang would testify that when a student received a check, after they cashed the check, the gangs would take 20%. Sometimes the gang would take checks for students that didn't even show up, then cash the check and keep 100%. Other times the gangs would forge signatures, then cash the check, keep some of it, and give the rest to the student whose name was on the check. So many politicians argued that the government money was used to facilitate the gang activities, which included, and Jeff Fort and the Black Peace Donation was in the middle of all of it. This went on from the time the program was created to the time it ended halfway through the year of 1968. So a month later, Jeff Fort and other members of the gang was found guilty of conspiring to defraud the federal government by illegally attaining government money. 2 months later, Jeff was sentenced to 5 years for defrauding the federal government for his participation in the job training program. The violence in Chicago continued, and around 4th of July, 1972, a gangster disciple named Harry became a victim. He didn't make it. It was nothing, because in the past 48 hours, he was just 1 out of 18 that didn't make it. Aside from the 18 that lost their lives, 15 others were wounded within that same 48 hours. As for the aggravated and attempted murder case against Jeff, those charges were dropped, as the state could not locate the star witness, Harris. The violence continued into the new year. The number 3 man on the Peace Donation, eBay, was hit 3 times near 63rd Street. He told police that a man named Lawrence was the one that did it. One of the gangsters in Chicago was hiding in the bushes, waiting for his target, and when Jeff's brother, Benny, was on his way into his apartment building, that gangster hopped out the bushes and unloaded. Benny survived. While Jeff was in prison, the old and young members of the Peace Donation were fighting over power and started killing each other. Hairston was also behind bars, serving a 5 to 15 for solicitation to commit murder a few years ago. He was convicted of paying a few teenagers with sandwiches and a $5 bill each to 3 men. 2 of those men survived, but 1 didn't make it. Around the time when Doris Payne was in France stealing diamonds, back in Chicago, Benny Fort was released from the hospital so he could continue to live a life of a gangster. 3 days after his release, his other brother Eugene Fort was arrested for armed robbery and home invasion. This was around the time President Nixon resigned from his presidency.
Therefore, I shall resign the presidency effective at noon tomorrow.
At the beginning of 1977, Mickey Cogwell was hit 3 times in the back. He didn't make it. Mickey was the high-ranking gangster that went to the first inauguration of President Nixon 8 years earlier. By this time, Jeff was released from prison and renamed the Black Peace Donation to El Rukin. This caused a split in the gang, as some members wanted to remain Black Peace Stones, and some became El Rukin and stayed under the leadership of Jeff. Halfway through 1979, law enforcement used sledgehammers to break down the steel doors of the headquarters and arrested his brother Andrew. The gang simply was maneuvering around Chicago like they owned the city. By the end of 1980, Jeff led police on a high-speed chase, and when they finally pulled over, Jeff was in the driver's seat chilling. He was wearing a full-length mink coat. The passenger had on a full-length fox coat. While the police were asking Jeff for his driver's license, 4 cars pulled up. 2 cars parked in front of the police car, and the other 2 parked behind the police car. The members of the gang hopped out, and they were all wearing full-length fur coats with their hands in their pockets. The officers called for backup, and since Jeff had no license or ID, he was arrested. The next day, 30 members of El Rukin showed up at the precinct to make sure he was safe. The El Rukin headquarters was raided again and again. Jeff would be arrested in another overnight raid on the headquarters, where 30 guns and more powdery substances were confiscated. Halfway through the year, 1982, Benny Fort hit a woman during an argument over a television. She called 911, and when police got there, she told them that Benny once killed a guy named Darrell. Benny was then indicted by a Cook County grand jury for what he allegedly did to Darrell. 4 days later, Jeff was arrested with 16 other men at the El Rukin headquarters while they were looking for another member that was also involved in the alleged incident the woman with the TV set talked about. 3 days after that, Jeff's 2 brothers, Eugene and Johnny Fort, were indicted by Cook County grand jury for charges that they assaulted a woman and forced her to tell them the location of a witness in the case involving their other brother, Benny, who was charged with. The next day, law enforcement went into one of the apartments where Jeff lives and arrested 7 men when they found stolen typewriters and white powdery substances. Since the Fort brothers intimidated the witness, the other witnesses were placed into protective custody. Ultimately, Benny Fort was acquitted on the murder charge but convicted on aggravated and sentenced to 2 years in prison for what he did to that woman while trying to take her television. The next month, Eugene Fort was found guilty of intimidation for threatening to kill a witness. The story was reported that both Eugene and Johnny Fort thought the woman witnessed the murder their brother Benny was charged with, so they grabbed her up and demanded to know where the other 2 witnesses were located. She refused to answer, so they threatened to kill her. At some point, she escaped and called police. While Jeff was in jail, he was indicted on other charges like narcotics and racketeering for phone conversations he was having that were secretly being recorded. New information came out that back in 1969, J. Edgar Hoover authorized an anonymous letter to be sent to Jeff to trick him into believing that the Black Panthers were his enemy and were plotting against him. Early 1984, Cornell Byrd, who was once a general in El Rukin, was sentenced to 10 years in prison for arson. Described as an ex-bodyguard for Jeff, a man named Cannon, who became El Rukin while he was in prison, just got sentenced to life after he killed a man. At the time of the Cannon was fresh out of prison and on his 7th month of parole after serving 13 years for another murder he committed back in the day. While Jeff was in a jail cell in Texas, he was still calling shots for the gang back in Chicago. Around that time, 8 members of El Rukin would be indicted for 9. One of the men that was a member of the organization for 17 years became an informant and testified that Jeff ordered the hit of a man named Bibbs. That wasn't enough. He went on to give information on 9 other murders that the organization was responsible for. Andrew Fort was arrested in Chicago on a Tuesday and charged with a gang-related of a man named Robert. Robert was a member of El Rukin, but he left to do his own thing and paid the price for making his own decisions. One of El Rukin locations was raided on a Tuesday at 6 a.m. by a task force of federal agents. They found a stockpile of weapons only the American military was allowed to have. At the same time, an additional raid was performed on another location where they found powdery substances. On a Thursday, an FBI agent testified that 3 men from El Rukin negotiated with an undercover federal agent to purchase 5 U.S. Army shoulder-mounted rockets. They ended up purchasing one of them, and at the end of July, unknown to them, it was equipped with an electronic radio transmitter that was being monitored by the feds. 3 months later, a federal grand jury indicted 4 members of El Rukin on traveling outside the United States, weapons and conspiracy charges, alleging they offered to carry out attacks in the United States on behalf of the Libyan government in return for funding. And while preparing for attacks, the 4 men collected equipment that was made specifically to penetrate the armor of a military tank. Andrew Fort was then found guilty of Robert in April the year before. While Jeff was serving time, members of El Rukin back in Chicago used to gather around a speakerphone in the headquarters to listen while Jeff gave orders to do illegal activities from his jail cell back in Texas. Because of the 30 El Rukin members that became informants, Jeff had no idea everything that he said for the past few months was recorded. By this time, law enforcement had 3,000 hours of recordings of Jeff and El Rukin's illegal activities. A man named Knox, who was convicted of posing as a lawyer for Jeff so he could get visits while Jeff was behind bars. Well, while Knox was in court, he admitted that he was communicating with the Libyan mission in New York City. He also testified that he and other members of El Rukin visited Libya multiple times. This information was harmful because there was speculation that El Rukin was conspiring to do harm to American citizens on behalf of the Libyan government. Another member of El Rukin named Anthony helped the government to indict Jeff and other members of El Rukin. See, Anthony was the one who gave law enforcement the information they needed in order for the court to approve the wiretaps on telephones used by Jeff. Anthony was implicated in the murder of a man named Vaughn and another named Joseph. So the government made Anthony an offer he couldn't refuse. For his cooperation, they dropped the charges of double and allowed him to plead guilty on a drug charge. An FBI agent testified that members of El Rukin met with Muammar Gaddafi and offered to commit acts of in the United States in return for $2.5 million. More informants corroborated the fact that Jeff was the one that ordered the hit on Bibbs back in 1981. Jeff was then indicted for allegedly sending 3 hitmen to do the job. Jeff's brother Andrew was sentenced to 40 years for the murder of a man named Robert. Another informant from El Rukin named Trammell said that he overheard Jeff and Gaddafi talking while Jeff was serving time in Texas. Jeff and El Rukin didn't know the phones were tapped, so when Jeff called the headquarters in Chicago, members would link the call to Gaddafi, and this was what Trammell explained to law enforcement. While Jeff was on trial, 2 women that were relatives of the witness for the prosecution were both hit in the hallway of the Ida B. Wells complex. Both victims were family members of the El Rukin informant named Trammell. Members of the jury complained about all the threatening phone calls they would receive, so the judge put the jurors in a secret location for the rest of the trial. After a 6-week trial, Jeff was found guilty on 49 counts. So at 40 years old, Jeff was sentenced to 80 years in prison for directing a for hire plot in return for $2.5 million from the Libyan government. After his trial on a Saturday morning on the south side, his brother Benny Ford was hit. He didn't make it. A 24-year-old man named Percy was charged with the crime. A member of El Rukin named Victor Johnson and 2 others surrendered to face charges for the mother of an informant named Anthony. That's the guy that helped law enforcement to get the warrant to tap the phones. Jesse Jackson had a brother. His name was Noah. Well, Noah was arrested for hiring a few members of El Rukin to do a hit on 3 people. At his trial, the El Rukin members turned government witnesses and testified against Noah, and he was found guilty and sentenced to life in prison. Right before Jeff went on trial for what he did to Bibbs, Hairston ended up getting hit. He didn't make it. Willie Fort was sentenced to 7 years for what he did to that woman. Jeff Fort was ultimately sentenced to 75 years for the murder of Bibbs. He will begin serving that 75-year sentence after he completes his 80-year sentence for conspiring to perform acts of domestic on behalf of a foreign government. At the time of this video, Jeff is almost 80 years old. This was the story of Jeff Fort and his gang. If you enjoyed this content, click on the next episode from Big City Crime TV.